I thought I was just helping my daughter save her marriage when I handed over my credit card for their romantic getaway. But when I saw them blow through my entire retirement fund on luxury dinners and spa treatments, while their kids asked me why daddy never calls, I made one phone call that would destroy everything. What happened when I froze their cards mid-vacation and discovered the real reason behind their trip? The phone rang at 11:30 on a Friday night, jolting me awake from the first decent sleep I had gotten in weeks. My daughter Nala's voice was thick with tears and desperation when I answered. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words at first. Between the hiccups and sniffles, she managed to tell me that her marriage to Simon was falling apart and they desperately needed time alone to fix things before it was too late. I sat up in bed, instantly alert and worried about my daughter's pain. Nala explained that she and Simon had been fighting constantly for months, screaming matches that kept my twin grandsons Tyler and Tommy awake at night. The boys had started wetting the bed again, and Tyler had been getting into trouble at school because he couldn't concentrate. She said they had found a marriage counselor in Cabo who specialized in intensive weekend retreats for couples in crisis. My heart ached listening to my daughter's broken voice describe how hopeless everything felt. Simon had been working longer hours lately, coming home angry and distant. Nala suspected he might be having an affair but was too scared to confront him directly. She believed this trip was their last chance to save their family before everything completely fell apart. How could I possibly say no to helping save my daughter's marriage and protecting my grandsons from a broken home? Without hesitation, I agreed to watch Tyler and Tommy for the weekend. I had been babysitting them every Saturday for the past 3 months anyway, while Nala worked her second job at the department store. The boys loved staying at my house because I let them build blanket forts in the living room, and we always made chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast. Taking care of them for a whole weekend would be no problem at all. Saturday morning arrived with the usual chaos of 7-year-old twins bouncing off the walls with energy. I was standing at the stove flipping pancakes when I heard heavy footsteps on my front porch. Simon walked into my kitchen without knocking, something that always made me uncomfortable but I never said anything about. He was dressed in expensive clothes I had never seen before, and was scrolling through his phone instead of greeting his children who were excitedly trying to show him their latest Lego creation. Tyler ran up to his father with a huge smile, tugging on Simon's designer shirt sleeve. The little boy had spent an hour that morning building an elaborate castle and wanted nothing more than to share his accomplishment with his daddy. But Simon barely glanced down at his son, brushing off Tyler's eager hands like he was swatting away an annoying fly. The dismissal was so cold and casual that it made my stomach clench with anger I tried hard to swallow. Instead of sitting down to have breakfast with his family like a normal father would do, Simon got straight to the point of his visit. He needed my credit card because their own cards were maxed out and the resort in Cabo required a deposit for their couple's therapy sessions. The way he said it wasn't really a request, it was more like a demand, as if I owed him access to my money. Something about his tone and attitude made warning bells go off in my head. I hesitated for just a moment, looking at Tyler's disappointed face as the little boy slowly walked back to his brother at the kitchen table. Tommy was watching the whole interaction with those big, serious eyes that seemed too old for his 7-year-old face. Both boys had learned not to expect much attention from their father, which broke my heart every time I witnessed it. But Simon was getting impatient, tapping his foot and sighing dramatically like I was being unreasonable. Against my better judgment, I went to my purse and pulled out my emergency Visa card. This was the credit card I kept for true emergencies, the one connected to my small retirement savings account that was supposed to last me through my golden years. I had never used it for anything except the time my furnace broke in the middle of winter and when I needed emergency dental work last year. Handing it over to Simon felt wrong, but I convinced myself I was helping save my daughter's marriage. Simon snatched the card from my hand without even saying thank you and headed straight for the door. He didn't kiss his children goodbye or tell them when he would be back. He didn't ask about their school projects or acknowledge that Tyler was still hoping for some attention. The man just walked out of my house like he was leaving a hotel, not saying goodbye to his own flesh and blood who wouldn't see him for an entire weekend. After Simon left, I tried to make the morning fun for the boys by letting them help me finish making breakfast. We added extra chocolate chips to the pancakes, and I let them drink orange juice from my fancy glasses that I usually saved for special occasions. But I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in my chest. Something about Simon's behavior seemed different this time, more urgent and secretive than usual. Tyler kept asking when Mommy and Daddy would be back, and I found myself giving vague answers because I realized I didn't actually know their travel plans. Nala had been so upset during our phone call that we never discussed specifics about their itinerary or when exactly they would return. All I knew was that they were going to Cabo for marriage counseling and would be back sometime Sunday evening. As the day went on, I tried to push away my worried thoughts by focusing on the boys. We built a massive fort using every blanket and pillow in my house. We played board games and watched cartoons, and I read them extra bedtime stories that night. But even as I tucked them into their beds in my spare room, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in Simon's eyes when he demanded my credit card. The twins fell asleep easily, exhausted from a day of fun and attention they rarely got at home. I sat in my living room afterward, staring at my phone and wondering if I should call Nala to check that they had arrived safely. But I decided against it, not wanting to interrupt what might be an important conversation with their marriage counselor. Little did I know that at that very moment, my credit card was being used for something completely different from what I had been told. Sunday morning started peacefully enough with the boys helping me make our traditional chocolate chip pancakes. Tommy was carefully measuring flour while Tyler stirred the batter, both of them chattering excitedly about building another blanket fort after breakfast. I was enjoying their innocent joy when my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood turn to ice. A fraud alert from my credit card company showed a charge of $2,847 at something called Casa Bonita Resort Spa. My hands started shaking as I stared at the number on my phone screen. That single charge was more money than I usually spent in 3 months. Before I could even process what I was seeing, another alert came through for $1,200 at a place called Eduardo's Fine Dining. Then another for $800 at luxury beach excursions. The charges kept coming, one after another, each one larger and more outrageous than the last. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of what was happening while the boys continued their pancake preparation, completely unaware that their grandmother's world was crashing down around her. In less than 24 hours, Simon and Nala had spent over $6,000 of my retirement money. This wasn't marriage counseling. This was a luxury vacation being funded by my life savings. With trembling fingers, I called my daughter's cell phone, praying there was some reasonable explanation for these massive charges. Maybe the marriage counselor was more expensive than they had expected. Maybe there were additional fees they hadn't anticipated. Maybe my credit card company had made some kind of mistake with their alert system. But deep down, I already knew the truth was going to be much worse than I wanted to believe. Nala answered after several rings, and I could immediately tell something was very wrong. Her voice sounded different, giddy and carefree in a way that seemed completely inappropriate for someone who was supposed to be working on saving her marriage. In the background, I could hear loud music, people laughing, and the unmistakable sound of glasses clinking together in celebration. This didn't sound like a serious therapy session at all. I tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable as I asked about the charges appearing on my credit card statement. I explained that the amount seemed quite high for what I understood to be a simple marriage counseling retreat. But instead of showing concern or embarrassment about the excessive spending, Nala actually laughed. She told me they had decided to really live it up because Simon convinced her they deserved to enjoy themselves after everything they had been through recently. The casual way she dismissed my concerns made my anger start to build. This was my emergency fund, money I had saved carefully over years of living on a fixed income. It was supposed to cover unexpected medical bills or home repairs, not fund my son in, Law's idea of a good time. When I tried to explain that they had already spent my entire emergency savings, Nala cut me off with an irritated sigh. She told me not to be so dramatic and promised they would pay me back eventually. Simon had some big business deals coming through, she said, and money wouldn't be a problem much longer. But I knew all about Simon's big deals. They never materialized into actual income. For the past 5 years, he had been chasing one get-rich-quick scheme after another, while Nala worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat financially. As I hung up the phone, I looked at Tyler and Tommy sitting at my kitchen table, syrup on their faces and complete trust in their eyes. These innocent children had no idea their parents had just blown what should have been their college fund money on margaritas and spa treatments. The betrayal felt like a physical punch to my stomach, but it also awakened something fierce and protective inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I spent the next hour on the phone with my credit card company, learning about my options for disputing charges and protecting my remaining credit limit. The customer service representative was sympathetic, but explained that since I had voluntarily given the card to Simon, my legal options were limited. However, she could freeze the card immediately to prevent any additional charges from being processed. The decision to freeze the card felt both terrifying and empowering. I was taking control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of my hands, but I also knew there would be serious consequences. Simon and Nala were probably planning to spend even more of my money during their remaining time in Cabo. When they discovered the card wouldn't work anymore, they were going to be furious with me. Sure enough, my phone started ringing within minutes of the card being frozen. First, it was Nala calling, but I let it go straight to voicemail. Then Simon called, and something told me I needed to answer this time. His voice was slurred with alcohol and filled with rage as he screamed at me through the phone. They were apparently stuck at an expensive restaurant with a $500 dinner bill and no way to pay for it. Simon's true character came out during that phone call in ways that shocked me despite years of watching his selfish behavior. He called me a bitter old woman and accused me of trying to ruin their marriage out of jealousy and spite. He claimed I was sabotaging their happiness because I couldn't stand to see them succeed. The cruelty in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from him before. But what made me angriest was when he dismissed my concerns about Tyler and Tommy. When I mentioned that the boys had been asking about their parents and that Tommy had wet the bed from anxiety, Simon's response was cold and heartless. He said I was being manipulative by bringing the children into our adult problems. He didn't seem to care at all that his sons were confused and worried about their family. The phone call ended with Simon making a threat that sent chills down my spine. He told me I had just ruined everything and that Nala would never forgive me for what I had done. His voice was ice cold as he promised that there would be consequences for my interference in their lives. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. As I sat in my quiet kitchen, watching Tyler and Tommy finish their pancakes while completely unaware of the drama swirling around them, I realized this was about much more than money. This was about protecting these innocent children from parents who were willing to steal from their own family to fund their selfish desires. The question that terrified me most wasn't whether I could survive Simon's threats. It was whether my relationship with my daughter could survive the truth about who she had become. 3 days of complete silence from blank. Nala and Simon felt like torture, but I refused to give in and call them first. I kept myself busy taking care of Tyler and Tommy, who were starting to ask more difficult questions about when their parents would come home. Tommy had another accident during his afternoon nap, and Tyler was having nightmares about monsters that looked suspiciously like his father. I was reading them bedtime stories when my phone finally rang with a call that would turn everything upside down. The voice on the other end belonged to a man I had never heard before, speaking in a cold, professional tone that immediately put me on edge. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, Simon's business partner, and he was calling to inform me that there had been a serious problem with their trip to Cabo. My heart started racing as I imagined car accidents or medical emergencies, but what he told me next was far worse than anything I could have prepared myself for. Marcus explained that Simon had been arrested at the Cabo airport for trying to use a stolen credit card to purchase additional plane tickets. The card in question was mine, but Simon had apparently tried to change the billing information to make it appear as though it belonged to him. When the fraud detection system flagged the transaction, airport security had detained him for questioning. The situation had escalated quickly when Simon became belligerent and started screaming at the officers in broken Spanish. My legs felt weak as I sank into my kitchen chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Marcus continued his explanation in that same detached tone, telling me that Simon was currently sitting in a Mexican jail cell, awaiting a hearing with a judge who would decide whether to press charges for credit card fraud. The legal fees alone would cost thousands of dollars, and that was assuming they could find a lawyer willing to take the case on short notice. But the revelation that made my blood run cold came next. Marcus told me that this wasn't Simon's first brush with financial crimes. Apparently, my son-in-law had a history of credit card fraud and identity theft going back several years. He had been using fake business partnerships and shell companies to steal money from investors, including elderly people who trusted him with their retirement savings. I had been married to a criminal for 5 years and never known it. The phone call was interrupted by frantic pounding on my front door that made both Tyler and Tommy jump up from their coloring books with frightened expressions. Through the window, I could see Nala standing on my porch, but she looked nothing like the composed woman who had left for vacation just days earlier. Her expensive vacation clothes were wrinkled and stained, her hair was a mess, and her makeup was streaked down her face like she had been crying for hours. I hung up on Marcus and rushed to open the door, and Nala immediately collapsed into my arms with sobs that shook her entire body. Between the tears and hyperventilation, she tried to tell me what had really happened during their trip to Cabo. There had been no marriage counseling retreat, no intensive therapy sessions, and no attempt to save their relationship. The entire trip had been Simon's idea of a farewell celebration before he disappeared with all of their money. The truth came pouring out of my daughter like water from a broken dam. Simon had been planning to leave her for months, quietly moving money out of their joint accounts and preparing to start a new life somewhere else. He had convinced Nala that the trip was about saving their marriage. But really he was planning to clean out her remaining assets and then abandon her and the children. The expensive resort, the fancy dinners, and the luxury excursions had all been paid for with money he had stolen from her and from me. But the betrayal went even deeper than I could have imagined. While they were in Cabo, Simon had met another woman named Scarlett, a wealthy widow from California who was vacationing alone. Within 2 days, he had convinced this woman that he was a successful businessman going through a difficult divorce, and she had agreed to help him start fresh in a new city. He had been planning to fly to Las Vegas with Scarlett, leaving Nala stranded in Mexico with no money and no way to get home. The only reason Nala was sitting in my kitchen instead of stuck in a foreign country was because I had frozen the credit card when I did. When Simon tried to buy the plane tickets to Vegas, the transaction was declined, and that's when everything fell apart. Scarlett realized she was being conned and called hotel security. The airport arrest happened when Simon tried to use my card one more time, this time with fake identification documents that Marcus had apparently provided. As Nala sobbed against my shoulder, I felt a mixture of relief and horror that I had never experienced before. Relief that my daughter was safe and hadn't been completely abandoned in a foreign country. Horror that I had allowed this predator into our family and given him access to innocent children for so many years. The warning signs had all been there, but I had been too polite and too trusting to recognize them for what they were. Tyler and Tommy approached us cautiously, their little faces full of confusion and worry as they watched their mother cry harder than they had ever seen before. Tommy climbed onto Nala's lap and patted her hair gently, trying to comfort her the same way she had comforted him during his nightmares. Tyler stood beside my chair and took my hand, squeezing it tight like he was trying to give me strength, even though he didn't understand what was happening. The moment was interrupted by another phone call, this time from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice with a thick accent introduced herself as Detective Rosa Martinez from the Cabo Police Department. She was calling to inform me that Simon had been formally charged with credit card fraud and would be held in custody until his court hearing in 2 weeks. She also wanted to warn me that Simon had been making threatening phone calls from jail, specifically mentioning my name and address. Detective Martinez explained that Simon had been telling other inmates that I was responsible for ruining his life and that he would make me pay for interfering in his business. The threats were serious enough that she felt obligated to contact local police in my area and recommend that I take precautions for my safety. She also mentioned that Simon's arrest had uncovered evidence of a much larger fraud operation that might involve other victims in several states. After hanging up with the detective, I looked at my daughter and my grandson sitting in my kitchen, and I realized that our nightmare was just beginning. Simon wasn't just a selfish husband and father. He was a dangerous criminal who had been using our family as cover for his illegal activities. The money he had stolen from me was probably just a small part of a much bigger scheme that could destroy innocent people's lives. But as I watched Tyler help his little brother wipe away tears, and as I saw the determination growing in Nala's eyes as she began to understand the full scope of what Simon had done to us, I knew we weren't going to be victims anymore. Simon had made one crucial mistake when he decided to target our family. He had underestimated the strength that comes from 3 generations of women who were finally ready to fight back against his manipulation and lies. The question that kept running through my mind wasn't whether we could survive what Simon had done to us. It was whether Simon would survive what we were about to do to him. The threatening phone calls started at 3 in the morning, exactly 1 week after Simon's arrest in Mexico. I was sound asleep when my landline rang with a harsh, jarring sound that immediately woke up both Tyler and Tommy in the next room. The voice on the other end was Simon's, but it sounded different, rougher, and more dangerous than I had ever heard before. He had somehow gotten access to a phone in the Mexican jail, and he was using it to terrorize me from hundreds of miles away. Simon's words were slurred and angry as he told me exactly what he planned to do to me when he got out of jail. He knew where I lived. He knew my daily routine. And he had friends who could visit me long before he was released from custody. The threats were specific and graphic enough to make my hands shake as I held the phone, but I forced myself to listen to every word so I could report them to the police later. When I finally hung up, I found Tyler and Tommy standing in my bedroom doorway, their faces pale with fear. The boys had heard enough of the conversation to know that their father was angry with me, but they didn't understand why or what it meant for our safety. I spent the rest of that sleepless night sitting in the living room with a baseball bat across my lap, watching the windows and trying to convince myself that Simon couldn't actually hurt us from a jail cell in another country. But the fear was real, and it was affecting all of us in ways I hadn't anticipated. By morning, I had made the decision to contact Detective Martinez again and ask for help dealing with Simon's threats. She was sympathetic and professional, as she explained that international harassment cases were complicated, but she could work with local police to increase patrols around my neighborhood. She also suggested that I document every threatening call and consider changing my phone number to make it harder for Simon to reach me. The detective also shared some information that made Simon's threats even more terrifying. During their investigation of his activities, they had discovered that Simon was connected to a network of criminals who specialized in targeting elderly people with financial scams. These weren't just random crimes. They were carefully planned operations designed to identify vulnerable victims and steal their life savings through elaborate schemes. Simon's role in the organization had been to identify potential targets by marrying women with elderly parents who had substantial retirement savings. He would spend months gaining the family's trust before gradually gaining access to their financial information and credit cards. The trip to Cabo had been meant as a celebration before he moved on to his next victim, but my decision to freeze the credit card had exposed the entire operation. The revelation that I had been deliberately targeted from the beginning made me feel sick and stupid at the same time. Every kind gesture I had made towards Simon, every time I had babysat the children while he worked late, every holiday dinner where I had welcomed him into my home, all of it had been part of his plan to steal from me. He had been studying my habits and my weaknesses for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But Detective Martinez also shared some encouraging news. Simon's arrest had led to a much larger investigation that was uncovering victims across multiple states. Federal agents were now involved, and they were building a case that could put Simon and his associates in prison for decades. The evidence they had collected included detailed records of his financial crimes going back over 10 years. The phone calls from Mexico continued for 3 more days, each one more threatening than the last. Simon had apparently learned about the federal investigation and was blaming me for destroying his entire operation. He described in vivid detail what he would do to me when he was released, and he also began making threats against Tyler and Tommy that made my protective instincts kick into overdrive. I finally decided to take action beyond just reporting the calls to police. Working with Nala, we contacted a local news reporter who specialized in stories about crimes against elderly people. Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News was immediately interested in our story, especially when we explained how Simon's operation had been targeting grandparents across the region. She wanted to do an investigative piece that would warn other families about these types of scams. The decision to go public with our story was scary but necessary. Sarah came to my house with a camera crew and spent an entire afternoon interviewing me, Nala, and even Tyler and Tommy about how Simon's crimes had affected our family. The boys were surprisingly articulate as they talked about how their father had never really paid attention to them and how much happier they were living with me. During the interview, Sarah revealed additional information that her research team had uncovered about Simon's criminal network. They had identified at least 12 other elderly victims across 3 states, with total losses exceeding $2 million. Most of the victims were women between the ages of 65 and 80 who had been targeted through family connections, just like I had been. The news story aired on a Friday evening, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. By Saturday morning, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from other victims who recognized Simon's name and wanted to share their experiences. Many of them had similar stories of being approached by charming young men who gained their trust before stealing their retirement savings. One caller was particularly memorable, an 80-year-old woman named Margaret, whose grandson had introduced her to Simon at a family barbecue 2 years earlier. Simon had convinced her to invest in a fake real estate development project, and she had lost her entire inheritance from her late husband. She had been too embarrassed to report the crime because she felt stupid for being tricked, but seeing our story on television had given her the courage to contact police. The news coverage also brought unexpected support from our community. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by to check on us and offer help with anything we might need. The manager at Tyler and Tommy's school called to express concern about their safety and to arrange for additional security during pickup and drop-off times. Even my postal worker, Mrs. Kim, made a point of telling me she would keep an eye out for any suspicious activity around my house. But the most surprising response came from Simon's former business partner, Marcus Webb, who had initially called to tell me about Simon's arrest. After seeing the news story, Marcus contacted Sarah Chen directly and offered to provide evidence that could help convict Simon and his associates. Apparently, Marcus had been keeping detailed records of their criminal activities because he suspected that Simon would eventually try to frame him for their crimes. Marcus's evidence included bank records, email communications, and even audio recordings of Simon discussing his plans to target elderly victims. The recordings were particularly damning because they showed Simon laughing about how easy it was to manipulate stupid old people into trusting him with their money. Hearing those words in Simon's own voice was painful, but it also confirmed that I had made the right decision to fight back against his schemes. As the weekend ended and we prepared for another week of uncertainty about what would happen next, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our situation. We were no longer just victims hiding from a dangerous criminal. We had become part of a larger movement to expose and stop the people who prey on elderly Americans. The question was no longer whether we could survive what Simon had done to us, but whether Simon and his criminal network could survive the forces that were now gathering against them. 2 weeks after the news story aired, I was washing dishes when Tyler came running into the kitchen with tears streaming down his face and a crumpled piece of paper clutched in his small fist. He had been playing in the backyard when a strange woman approached him over the fence, claiming to be his father's sister and demanding that he take a message to me. The paper contained a handwritten note that made my blood turn to ice as I read the threatening words scrawled in familiar handwriting. Simon had somehow managed to get someone to deliver his message from the Mexican jail, and the contents were more terrifying than any of his previous phone calls. He knew that I had spoken to reporters and federal agents, and he was promising that there would be serious consequences for my betrayal of his trust. But what made the note truly frightening was the specific details it contained about Tyler and Tommy's daily routines, including their school schedules, their favorite playground, and even the route we took to get groceries every week. The woman who had approached Tyler was described as having bleached blonde hair and expensive jewelry, wearing clothes that looked out of place in our modest neighborhood. She had asked Tyler personal questions about where he lived and whether his grandmother was home, trying to gather information under the pretense of being a concerned family member. The fact that Simon's associates were now actively surveilling us meant that the situation had escalated far beyond simple harassment. I immediately called Detective Martinez, who took the threat seriously enough to contact the FBI agents working on Simon's case. Within hours, federal agents were at my house, interviewing Tyler about his encounter with the mysterious woman and setting up surveillance equipment to monitor our property. Agent Rebecca Foster explained that Simon's criminal network was more extensive than they had initially realized, with connections to organized crime groups that specialized in witness intimidation. The revelation that Simon was connected to organized crime sent shockwaves through our quiet neighborhood. Agent Foster explained that these criminal organizations often targeted families of people who cooperated with law enforcement, using threats and violence to discourage witnesses from testifying in court. She recommended that we consider entering witness protection until Simon's trial was completed, but the thought of uprooting Tyler and Tommy from the only stable home they had ever known was heartbreaking. As we discussed our options with the federal agents, Nala made a discovery that added another layer of horror to our situation. While going through old financial documents to help with the federal investigation, she found evidence that Simon had been stealing from Tyler and Tommy's college savings accounts for over 2 years. The boys had inherited money from their grandfather Paul's life insurance policy, but Simon had been gradually draining those accounts to fund his criminal activities. The theft of the children's inheritance money felt like the ultimate betrayal, worse even than what Simon had done to me. Those accounts represented Paul's final gift to his grandsons, money that was supposed to secure their educational futures and give them opportunities he never had. Simon had not only stolen their present security, but had also robbed them of the future their grandfather had tried to provide for them. But the discoveries didn't stop there. Agent Foster's investigation had uncovered evidence that Simon had been planning to kidnap Tyler and Tommy and take them out of the country before his arrest in Mexico. Phone records showed that he had been researching international custody laws and making contact with people who specialized in helping criminals disappear with their children. The trip to Cabo had been intended as a test run for a much larger escape plan. The kidnapping plot explained why Simon had been so dismissive of the boys during his last visit to my house. He hadn't been ignoring them out of indifference. He had been mentally preparing to tear them away from everyone they loved and drag them into a life of constant running and hiding. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't frozen that credit card made me physically sick with relief and terror. Agent Foster also revealed that the federal investigation had uncovered a pattern of violence in Simon's past that none of us had known about. His previous relationships had ended with restraining orders and assault charges, but he had been careful to keep that information hidden from Nala and her family. The charming, manipulative man we thought we knew was actually a dangerous predator with a history of escalating violence against women and children. The news about Simon's violent history prompted Agent Foster to assign a protective detail to our house, with federal agents taking shifts to watch over us around the clock. The agents were professional and discreet, but their presence was a constant reminder of how much danger we were actually in. Tyler and Tommy were fascinated by the agents at first, but soon grew tired of being unable to play outside freely or visit their friends without supervision. 3 days after the protective detail was established, we received news that would transform our understanding of everything that had happened. Detective Martinez called to inform us that Simon had been found dead in his jail cell in Mexico, apparently the victim of a violent attack by other inmates. The Mexican authorities were investigating the death as a homicide, but early reports suggested that Simon had been killed because he owed money to dangerous people. The news of Simon's death created a complex mixture of emotions that none of us had been prepared for. Relief that the immediate threat to our safety was over, combined with guilt about feeling relieved that another human being was dead. For Tyler and Tommy, It meant grappling with the loss of their father, even though that father had been planning to hurt them in ways they were too young to fully understand. But Simon's death also raised new questions about our safety and the ongoing federal investigation. Agent Foster explained that Simon's criminal associates were still active and might blame us for the collapse of their operation. The investigation had identified at least 6 other members of the fraud network who were still at large, and some of them had histories of violence that made Simon look like an amateur. The most disturbing revelation came when Agent Foster showed us evidence that Simon's death might not have been random jail violence. Phone records indicated that Simon had been planning to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, potentially exposing the entire criminal network. His death had occurred just days before his scheduled interview with FBI agents, suggesting that someone had ordered his killing to prevent him from talking. As we sat in my living room that evening, surrounded by federal agents and trying to process the magnitude of what we had learned, I realized that our nightmare was far from over. Simon's death had eliminated one threat, but potentially created several new ones. His criminal associates now had nothing to lose, and every reason to silence the family that had triggered the investigation that destroyed their operation. Looking at Tyler and Tommy as they tried to understand why their father was never coming home, I knew that our fight for safety and justice was just beginning. The question that haunted me wasn't whether we could survive what Simon had done to us. It was whether we could survive what his criminal associates might do to us next, and whether justice would ever truly be served for all the innocent victims who had suffered at their hands. 6 months later, I was sitting in a federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix, watching as the last member of Simon's criminal network was sentenced to 25 years in prison for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The woman with bleached blonde hair who had approached Tyler in our backyard turned out to be Karen Mitchell, the mastermind behind the entire operation, and someone whose reach extended far beyond anything we had initially imagined. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, representing over 50 elderly people who had lost their life savings to the sophisticated fraud scheme that Karen had been running for nearly a decade. I held Tyler's hand on one side and Tommy's on the other as we listened to the judge describe the scope of the crimes that had destroyed so many innocent lives. The boys had insisted on being present for the sentencing, wanting to see justice served for their grandfather Paul's stolen inheritance. Karen's arrest had been the breakthrough that federal agents needed to dismantle the entire criminal network. After Simon's death in the Mexican jail, she had made the mistake of trying to intimidate us directly, not realizing that our house was under surveillance by FBI agents. When she approached Tyler in our backyard, hidden cameras had captured her face clearly enough to identify her as someone who had been wanted by law enforcement for years. The investigation that followed Karen's arrest revealed the true scope of her criminal empire. She had been recruiting young men like Simon to marry into families with elderly parents, specifically targeting women whose parents had substantial retirement savings or valuable property. The men would spend months or even years gaining trust before gradually gaining access to financial information and valuable assets. Agent Foster testified during the trial about how sophisticated the operation had been. Karen had maintained detailed files on potential victims, including financial records, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She had even hired private investigators to research targets before deploying her recruits to infiltrate their families. My file had contained photographs of my house, copies of my banking records, and notes about my relationship with Nala and the grandchildren. The most shocking revelation came when prosecutors presented evidence that Karen had been responsible for at least 3 suspicious deaths among elderly victims who had become too suspicious or tried to report her associates to authorities. Simon's death in the Mexican jail had also been orchestrated by Karen's associates, not because he owed money to criminals, but because she was afraid he would cooperate with federal investigators and expose her operation. During her testimony, Karen showed no remorse for the lives she had destroyed or the families she had torn apart. She sat at the defendant's table with a cold, calculating expression, occasionally smirking when victims described how her schemes had devastated their retirement years. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was simply a businesswoman who had made poor choices, but the evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Margaret, the elderly woman who had called me after seeing our news story, took the witness stand to describe how Karen's associate had stolen her late husband's inheritance. Margaret's voice was steady and strong, as she explained how the theft had forced her to sell her home and move into subsidized housing, losing not just her financial security, but also her independence and dignity. Tyler surprised everyone, including me, when he asked to address the court during the victim impact portion of the proceedings. Standing at the podium with his 7-year-old voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, he told the judge about how his father had never really loved him or his brother, and how his great-grandfather Paul's stolen money was supposed to help them go to college someday. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, as this brave little boy spoke about forgiveness and justice in ways that shamed the adults who had caused so much pain. The judge's final sentence exceeded what even the prosecutors had requested. Karen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to prey on innocent families. The judge specifically mentioned the targeting of elderly victims and the corruption of family relationships as aggravating factors that warranted the harshest possible punishment. In addition to the criminal sentences, a civil lawsuit had resulted in the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets that would be returned to victims over the coming months. My emergency fund would be fully restored, along with Tyler and Tommy's college accounts and additional compensation for the trauma we had endured. But more importantly, the federal investigation had led to new laws and enforcement mechanisms designed to protect elderly Americans from similar fraud schemes. As we walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Tyler and Tommy were laughing and playing on the courthouse steps, their resilience and joy restored despite everything they had been through. Nala had found a new job with better pay and was rebuilding her life with a strength and independence I hadn't seen in her since she was a teenager. The experience had also brought unexpected gifts to our family. The federal agents who had protected us had become like extended family members, staying in touch long after their official duties ended. The other victims we had met during the investigation had formed a support network that continued to help elderly people avoid financial scams. Our neighborhood had rallied around us in ways that restored my faith in human kindness and community solidarity. But perhaps the most important transformation had occurred within myself. I was no longer the passive, accommodating grandmother who had been afraid to speak up when something felt wrong. The experience had taught me that being polite and trusting doesn't mean being powerless, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's destructive behavior. As we drove home from the courthouse, Tyler asked me if we were safe now that the bad people were in prison. I told him that we were safe, but more importantly, we were strong. We had learned that we could survive anything as long as we faced it together with honesty, courage, and determination. The question wasn't whether we could handle whatever challenges might come next. It was what we would do with the wisdom and strength we had gained from surviving something that had initially seemed impossible to overcome.